Rogue One, a Star Wars Story, is a 2016 film directed by Gareth Edwards. In the film continuity of the rest of these Star Wars movies, it is set 1 week before the events of A New Hope, and details how the Death Star plans were stolen and how the Rebels won their first victory over the Empire, which is referenced in the opening scroll of A New Hope. It did come out 1 year after The Force Awakens and 1 year before The Last Jedi in the December release that Disney decided to do with all of the Star Wars movies they've done so far. What this did was give us the idea of, all right, we've already seen how they did one new Star Wars movie, but this one isn't quite a Star Wars movie. You know, it falls into this Star Wars stories, like the Solo movie, which I'm never going to mention again because I don't want to get you guys excited.
There's nothing out there.
Breathe. Breathing is like a physiological action. Like, it doesn't.
What? Maybe they're breathing. It's antimatter.
No, that's not. This antimatter isn't. It's the absence of matter. It's not the opposite.
Dark energy.
Well,
but I'm going to talk about a couple of terms that, you know, just really quickly that I'm going to be using. The first is just archetype, which is a pattern of behavior or a recurring symbol or motif. I use trope as well as trying to get this idea across. In Jungian psychology, there's this idea of a collective unconscious, kind of an instinctual understanding of certain events and personalities that, if you really believe the idea, is worldwide. So it's one of the reasons that stories in a mythological sense are so similar between cultures and even between time periods. The idea of Cinderella as a story exists in many, many different cultures around the world. Just the idea of, you know, here is a young girl and her mother or her parents are taken away, and it's kind of like a rags to riches story. And it taps into something universally that we can all understand. If an author wants to use these tropes or these archetypes, they are tapping into something shared collectively by all humans. And if you do that, odds are more humans will buy your book or watch your movie. So archetypes are very important from the writing standpoint when you're trying to create a story or whether you're trying to create characters. As I said, an example of this would be the rags to riches storyline, or more broadly, even like comedy or tragedy are archetypes that you can work with, or character archetypes like the trickster, you know, Loki, or the dangerous biker with a heart of gold, you know, or just like the rogue character, whatever it is. These are character tropes, archetypes that we can get to understand and get to know a character very, very quickly, and then see them actually go on their adventures. So, talking about the actual introduction, I'm really going to be looking at this through the lens of the hero's journey or the monomyth, and we've mentioned his name several times, and that's just Joseph Campbell, who is the author and scholar that popularized this theory. He's by no means the only one to talk about it, but he talked about it the most, and his words had the most emphasis when it came to this. So the theory of the monomyth does state that there is a common template that can be applied to all stories if we're trying to figure out how the story is built, especially those important tales of folklore and mythology that take place all over the world. His most important book was called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and it describes the basic narrative pattern. These are his words. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man.
Lord of the Rings.
It's very broad, but in a way it's supposed to be very broad. You're supposed to be able to apply it to lots of different stories to show that this is how the basic story works. I'm not gonna lie, this is contentious. It's not absolutely set in stone. A lot of theorists will actually argue that Joseph Campbell chose the stories to apply to this that he knew were going to fit, and while completely ignoring other stories that don't very well fit the monomyth. But I'm not really trying to argue whether or not this can be applied to every story. I'm trying to argue that it is being applied to the story I'm talking about, which is Rogue One. So it always begins one of two ways. You have two different options, which is the hero's call to action or the unusual birth. And that just kind of depends on where you feel like starting your story. A New Hope starts with the call to action because we don't see Luke as a baby or as a child. We see him as a relative adult who is able to go out and have adventures on his own. So when he is called to action, he is able to respond to that action. However, the first bit of Rogue One, in my opinion, should really be called a prologue, just like everything that David just said with Guardians of the Galaxy, because the main character starts as a kid. The prologue, the beginning section, isn't meant to be seen as part of the general narrative, the real story. Instead, this is supposed to be build up to let us know who this character is, what has she gone through, and why is she who she actually is? What has determined for her to be this character? So, featuring the main character as a child many years before the proper action of the film provides the unusual birth, and movies do this all the time. It happened in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. We saw it in 300, Finding Nemo, Batman, Forrest Gump. It's a very popular thing for us to have a character that is twisted in some way, who has gone through something, and we're going to show them go through this as a child so that we can understand why we have a flawed character now. Otherwise, it just opens up on a flawed character and we don't really know why. From a mythological standpoint, it's also, you got baby Moses floating down the Nile in a basket, and you have Hercules going through everything that he went through. So these are, no matter where you are, the idea of a child going through trauma or having an unusual beginning is something that kind of lets us know, signifies, this is the hero. This is the person that we are going to want to be watching for the rest of this movie. The important thing about this is that section can't really last very long. We don't want to see little Peter Quill actually mourning his mother. We don't want to see little Forrest Gump's sad childhood with his little leg braces for too long. It's too much. We want to see them grow up and learn to play football as fast as they possibly can so that we can get to the actual story of the movie. Otherwise, it's just super boring, to the point that we watch Simba go from a cub to a grown-up lion within a 15-second space in the middle of Hakuna Matata, because that's not important. No matter what Lion King 1.5 wants to tell you, that part is not actually important. Everything up to that point is introduction. So, to get into the actual movie and what is happening, Rogue One, I didn't remember this from watching it in previous times, but it is playing games with the fans left and right. They're just trying to make us think that it's like Star Wars, and then they pull the rug out from under us. It starts with the same blue letters on the screen a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, and then there's several seconds of blank screen where we're wondering if we're going to hear that music. Are we going to hear the John Williams theme? But instead, it starts with an unexpected stinger note and a distant planet pops up onto the screen. This is actually the exact same trick that they did for the music in the Force Awakens official teaser at the 23-second mark. What it does musically is it gives us the feeling that the story has already begun. Instead of starting with a slow theme that kind of builds and starts low, and then we get a theme that we can actually sing along to, just starting with a stinger, it lets us know that we're just joining in, action has already happened, the stakes are already very high, and we just need to hold on and we need to catch up. Then the camera pans up and shows a gray triangular shape start coming down from the top of the screen, which if you've watched any other Star Wars movie, fans are already thinking, that's some kind of starship. I don't know who it is, I don't know why it is, but it's coming and it's something. But then after it pans down a little bit more, we see these are actually the rings of a planet that they filmed at a very suspicious angle to make it look like a spaceship, which, I don't know, they did it, they were having fun with it. Again, they're just playing games with us. Let's pretend for a second that you are one of those very, very few people in the world that has never seen any Star Wars movies, and you're coming into this just completely blind. The movie is doing something for those people as well. What we are doing for those not fans is you see it open in space looking at a planet. So we know this is probably a science fiction film, but it could still be real life. Is it an Apollo mission? Is it something else? So immediately, as soon as we can, we try to get a spaceship in there to let them know that we are watching a science fiction movie. And we make this, if you're not familiar with Star Wars ship engineering, which lets us know that this is very obviously an evil ship just because of the angles and the design, like we've seen enough Star Wars ships at this time that we know this is not a nice guy ship. The music in the background will let anybody know that this ship is not a good thing. It's very low, it's very ominous, it's slowly building up to something, and there's just one ship by itself is coming in towards this planet. So you're watching this Imperial shuttle fly down to the planet, and we see it fly over a beach, which is nice because Disney really likes playing with the idea of, well, we've never seen this geography in Star Wars before, so here's a Florida beach. Why not? Go for you, Rogue One. And they get into the idea that each movie should have a really big geographic zone. And a lot of this movie takes place on beaches and around bodies of water, especially the ending scene when they're all fighting to try to get the transmission up into space. It's actually little islands that each have their own individual beaches. It's a stylistic choice. Running along that beach because she sees the shuttle coming in is a little girl who is very clearly freaked out, and this is the first human we meet since the movie opens. We then cut to a man watching some surveillance screens and a woman in the same house with him, and the magic of storytelling has the audience inferring that these three people are probably a family. The girl's running, and she's passing by some large metal pillars that look suspiciously familiar to the moisture evaporators on Luke Skywalker's Tatooine farm. Again, they're just kind of trying to get this idea across of this is a Star Wars movie for people who know how to recognize Star Wars movies. Just these little visual pieces, throwbacks that, oh, this is a very different planet. They're probably not actually moisture farming, but they do mention that he's farming and they don't mention what he's farming. So maybe he's doing the same thing. Actually, how they introduce the characters and how they show us the relationships between the characters breaks down very, very neatly. The girl runs in and she yells mama, which grants the audience the little rush that we feel when we think we're right about something. Oh, she was obviously the girl's mother the whole time. Then the man calls the girl by the name Jin. Gather your things, it's time. In the story, this lets us know by just about the first line of the movie, something dangerous is coming, but they've been expecting it. They have a plan. Lets us know something about the characters. These are people who plan ahead, very analytical, and they know what they're going to do. Her mom is in getting things together in the kitchen. The camera puts the jug of blue milk dead center in the middle of the screen and then just leaves it there like, hey guys, did you see it? Did you see the blue milk? Just in case. Again, just like a nudge towards all of the watchers who can get what the blue milk is and then explain it to everybody else afterwards. The mom makes a phone call, getting our fourth character introduced on the screen, and conveniently enough, she gives us two names at the exact same time by saying, Saw, it's Lyra. It's happening, he's come for us. Now we know the names of all of the characters we have met so far, and we know that the dangerous thing coming is a man, which is probably obvious because this is Star Wars, and he's flying in a shuttle, and men outnumber women in this universe by 3-1, so he's probably a man. But the man calls Jin over, he kneels down, and he lets her know that he's only doing this to protect her. He calls her by Stardust, which is her nickname, and she calls him Papa, further taking out any confusion about this family dynamic. Like, they're really going out of their way with dialogue and just the scenes to make sure that we understand that this is a family, this is a close family, and giving us the names behind it just in case we're not getting it. Then Lyra, the wife mother, calls him Galen, and we have all of the on-screen characters named 2 minutes and 28 seconds into the movie. Now we start getting to the bad guys, and we see after the shuttle lands, there are death troopers all dressed in black, and a general rule for cinema and story is that while it is possible to wear black and not be bad, that's probably not going to be our first assumption. But from Sauron to Darth Vader and the evil queen from Snow White, like these people wear black. It is possible for a lone character to wear black and not be evil. However, I think it's probably really hard to find a group of characters all wearing matching black armor to not be seen as evil. I tried really hard to think of an example where there are...
Would you accept matching black trench coats?
I mean...
Damn it.
I won't because then it ruins this. All right. So they were like 100% of the time, those people are going to be evil. And that's just the way it's going to be. And the movie has really set this up. You know, of course, this nice little family that we see drinking their blue milk and giving nicknames to their children are running from these people. So they are probably going to be evil. And it helps set up that there is a bad guy here. And we're only 2.5 minutes into it. And it's very ominous. They're not really showing the villain, kind of showing the monster yet. As they pan back and show these death troopers walking in the middle There's their leader who has this really billowing white cloak, but you don't really get to see his face. They're really keeping it panned back to try to keep him as secretive as possible until the actual altercation happens between him and Galen. So Lyra and Jin, they go hide until Lyra strangely decides to give Jin her necklace so she can promptly abandon her. And that's okay because it serves the narrative structure. And we've done a very important thing. We have a token or a sacred relic in this necklace that is given from mother to daughter that signifies something. We don't know what it signifies. We don't really know at this point why it is important, but it is determined to be so by its placement in the movie and the accompanying mystic words, trust the Force. Even if you know nothing about this, it seems very religious, it seems very mystic, it seems very sacred that she is giving her this necklace, saying to trust in a higher power, and then totally just leaving her and going back to do her thing. In a properly told story, this relic is going to come back further in to help the hero achieve their goals, either through inspiration or more directly as a kind of Chekhov's gun of, did you know that that necklace was the very key that she needed to actually defeat the big bad guy at the very end? Like, that's the way a lot of movies are actually going to do this. Doesn't really happen in this movie like that, but at least in the introduction, we kind of see what is happening thematically. Ben giving Luke his father's lightsaber, Frodo receiving the mithril vest from Bilbo, Harry Potter being given his invisibility cloak. These are all tropes of that idea of like the main character receiving a sacred object, usually from a father figure or a mother figure or just kind of a parent figure in general. The second archetype established by Lyra leaving Jin is the abandoned, lost, or orphaned child, which we really talked about when we were talking about Guardians of the Galaxy. It helps show who this character is and why they are doing what they're doing. We mentioned Harry Potter as well. That's another example. The Chronicles of Narnia, these kids are being drawn away from their parents to go have adventures without them. James and the Giant Peach, like anytime there's an orphan, you're working with this trope. You have to do away with the parent figure to allow for a few things. The child doesn't have a very good support system, so you have built-in tension, but they do have more freedom for hijinks and adventures because they are not disappointing or leaving the parent who is sitting there at home trying to support them. It's much harder to write a story with a hero character where they have a nice, loving parent sitting at home waiting and supporting them as they go off on their adventures. So as Galen Erso is confronted by Imperial Director Orson Krennic, who is our last named character in the introduction and just the source of all of this conflict that we have, wife Lyra pops back up because she feels like she can take them all, I guess. I don't know. They don't prop her up very well in this introduction. I think we are supposed to understand that she's not necessarily weak, but fully unprepared to live life without her husband. That's kind of what they're going for, that in the choice between saving her daughter and like being with her daughter and the potential to save her husband, she chooses her husband, which is kind of jarring for a lot of audiences who see that the mother is always going to go with the kids. That's kind of a more traditional thing. So in a way, it's kind of breaking our expectations that she does go back and try to save her husband at the expense of being able to actually be with her daughter. And of course, Jin sees everything happen because nothing really helps that abandoned child archetype like actually seeing their parent die, and this is a Disney movie, so the mother is not allowed in and just has to die anyway. Dads can stay and play as long as they are emotionally distant. That's fine.
Just like real dads.
Just like real dads. Great. So Jin goes into hiding until she's saved by Saw Gerrera, the dude that we saw talking to Lyra on the screen in the kitchen earlier. Him drawing her out of the little hidey hole and saying we have a long road ahead of us immediately makes us think that he will be her supernatural guide. He will be her Gandalf figure who is going to show her the secrets that she needs to exist in this world. And then before he even draws her out, the screen cuts and we're looking at the title screen for Rogue One, and everybody in the audience is thinking, oh wow, that's right, I forgot, we haven't actually seen this yet because it's 7 minutes and 45 seconds into the movie and we haven't actually seen the title of the movie yet. I haven't done a big comparison, but that feels like a really long time
pretty long
to me as far as introductions go, to just let you know what's going on before you see the title screen. It's just, that took me by surprise. We cut from the words and we see a woman asleep in the dark, the sound of dripping water, and the unmistakable sound of a jail cell door being opened, because even in space, the jail cell has to sound the exact same way it does in Wild Wild West, because we have to know what we're listening to. And in case the audience doesn't get it, they really hammer us over the head with the fact that she is in prison. We see her cellmates in a bunk. We see poor hygiene conditions. There's a small room. And then an intercom in the background says, check-in security cell block 4227. And then we hear a man scream in pain. And then we pan back to see bars on the door and taking the whole prison cell. And then you see a stormtrooper walk past the door checking on other inmates. So I feel like it's too much, personally. Like they're really not giving the audience any credit to understand that she is in prison. Instead, it's oh, is she in prison? Oh, she's probably in prison. Oh, she's really probably in prison now. And they just do it like 8 times. I think it's too much. We get it. She's in prison. We just saw little Jin get saved by Saw, though. So we're supposed to think, well, what happened to her? What happened to her mystic leader? It's like losing her mother and father at a very young age has interfered with her decision-making abilities, and somehow she's wound up in prison. How did that happen? But then immediately from that, you have your sweeping orchestral music and asteroids throttling towards the camera, which universally signifies that this is the end of the introduction. We have now gotten into the proper storyline, and we've met all of the characters. We've already seen one die. We've met our hero. We've seen her get scarred as a child. And now that she's grown up, we're ready for our story to actually begin, now that we're already 8 minutes and 45 seconds into the movie. So that's it. That's the introduction to Rogue One. I have a hard time with it because I both love it and think that they tried a little bit too hard and did not necessarily respect the audience with some of their storytelling. Actually having to go through and name all of the characters, having to show the relationships between the characters. I mean, they didn't go as far as saying like, dear husband, I will miss you. But
it's pretty fucking close.
They basically did.
It's pretty close.
You know? Yeah, it is. They really hand-fed the audience with all of the information to make sure that we weren't getting confused, to the point that it kind of got annoying to a certain point. Like I was still into it and I still really liked it, but I felt like they could have pulled some of that back, had a little bit less dialogue, a little bit fewer names, because it kind of doesn't matter at that point in the movie, and just let the scene build itself.
Of course, on one level, it also could be realistic because my nephews are both over at the house, and like they never talk to you without saying your name 5 times in the same sentence.
It's true.
So like the idea of Jin calling him Papa really makes a lot of sense to me, because you know, Peter does not talk to you without saying daddy, daddy, daddy 5 times.
Over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And
That is true. Yeah.
I mean, like Darth, I know your channel is a Star Wars one. I don't mean to be disparaging, but like, you know, it is Star Wars at the end of the day. Like you need to be clear. You need to be very you know, like on the nose to make sure everyone's on the same page. No one's left behind. It just needs to be inclusive, you know, like, yeah.
It's for everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a really good point. One of the questions that I've been asking myself as well is kind of the same question that I asked you earlier. Is this too dependent upon knowledge of the prior movies for it to actually make sense? And I think it would be really, really hard for somebody who has no knowledge of what the Death Star is to actually understand what is going down. I mean, yeah, you get like, bad guy is coming, wants to take dad, mom gets shot. That's pretty obvious. But besides that...
Yeah, in this movie, do they ever actually define the Death Star as a weapon that can blow up a planet? Or are they assuming the audience already knows?
They talk about it, when they're talking about the plans, they talk about it as a planet killer, but they don't name it as the Death Star until the very end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they just say the project that you're working on, or the weapon.
Okay, so like, it's an interesting question though, isn't it? Because I don't think there's anyone on who would be consuming this film who doesn't at least know what Star Wars kind of is about. They know it's like space lasers and Darth Vader. Like, even if you haven't seen a Star Wars movie, even my most media illiterate family know what Star Wars is. Like, they have an idea of it. It's kind of in the same way that like everybody knows who Batman and Spider-Man are, like, you know, and Superman. Like they're
Third reference.
everyone knows who Spider-Man is. I don't know, that's in my brain for some fucking reason. But you know, to the extent that you don't need to re-explain certain aspects of those properties. I don't need to see another Uncle Ben get shot. I don't need to see another Peter Parker get bitten by a spider. I don't need to see, you know, Superman come from Krypton again. We fucking get it, guys. It's fine.
And yet they have to do that in every movie.
It's because Zack Snyder really wanted to do Krypton, and you know, in his defense, it was pretty fucking sick. So whatever.
A lot of fallacies.
a lot of dicks in space.
Unexpected fallacies. Yeah.
I mean, between him and Dan Harmon, there's a lot of penises on screen at times. But it is interesting to the question of, does this rely too much on contextual knowledge of Star Wars? I think the story by itself still functions. It doesn't. It still has some of the bugbears of its compatriot Solo, where it sort of ends up, for the stakes to feel meaningful, it relies on you understanding that the Death Star is a plot crucial element. But the idea of this ragtag group of people going to steal these plans that are going to be bad for the people who live in this world, you know, these plans being developed by this dictatorship, I think that by itself stands alone as a pretty coherent story. It just so happens to be folded into Star Wars. And it feels like at times they use that context of it being Star Wars to punch up the stakes rather than relying on it to as like conveyance for why our characters are invested. Like, we understand that Jyn is being press ganged into being a good guy, and then she reluctantly accepts being a good guy. Like, I don't think the narrative structure or the arc of these characters off the back of that introduction relies on it being Star Wars. To almost its strength at times. I don't know how much I commit to that as a belief though, because it does periodically really fucking lampoon itself and be like, particularly at the end. It gets really egregious by the end. But I think throughout, like, it manages to not go too far, I don't think. I think it could have, you know, if halfway through we saw a fucking lightsaber or something when we met, you know, our Force sensitive dude, if he had a lightsaber, I'd say that would be taken one step too far. But I think it holds itself back enough. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Mm-hmm. I think, you know, I don't know, it's always an interesting exercise to like wonder, you know, like could this movie in a franchise work on its own? Could it be a coherent story? I think so, but you know, it's interesting that this movie in particular, like the thing that makes it so special is its connection to Star Wars, like how you know, the hole in the Death Star was, you know, this like egregious seemingly plot hole in the episode, you know, in A New Hope, and then in this movie it's like, oh, that was all intentional. And then that's like such, you know, that is a detail that is like super, like it makes this movie kind of, you know what I mean, like and then because it's also just like a really well coherently crafted story, it's just I don't know, it just works on like a lot of levels, I feel.
It's a retcon, but it's a well done retcon, and I think it makes the fans happy at the end of the day that we finally have an explanation for this very simple question of who left that hole there? Like, why would that be there? Who would design a ship with this kind of flaw? So while I understand that they are doing this as a fan service retcon, I'm cool with it. Like,
it's very eloquent. It's way better than like J.K. Rowling's retcons, where she just makes shit up and is like, "I promise to tell what I meant, guys. Don't check though." Like it's
your fault because you didn't get it.
One thing I really like particularly about the explanation, if I remember correctly, was that it wasn't just the fact that it was there and that you could shoot something into it, but the idea was that shooting something into an exhaust port would never do any critical damage, but he designed the interior of that exhaust port to empty into the reactor, which never would have happened. So it wasn't the fact that it was a port you could shoot into. That was never an issue. What he did was in the inner connectings of how everything worked, which is just another subtle thing to the fans of, you know, we're not explaining away the hole. The hole was never the issue. The interiors were the issue, and we thought about that, and this was the answer.
Can I ask you guys a devil's advocate question? So Batman Begins has a very similar opening structure. We start with young Bruce Wayne seeing Mama and Papa get shot. But then conversely, we then cut to Bruce Wayne in a Chinese prison beating the shit out of some dudes in the mud. Like that opening, I fucking love that opening sequence. And then he gets thrown in prison, and then he has exactly the same thing happen, which is in prison, someone says, look, I have a mission for you. Now, this story does the same thing, but it lingers far longer on the pre-prison stuff and skips the inciting incident that gets that character into that prison. One of the things that Batman Begins does is it conveys to us that Bruce Wayne is not only a force of will to be reckoned with, in that he's willing to take on these 5 or 10 dudes, but also that he's competent and dangerous enough that they throw him in isolation to protect the other people. We don't learn, which is a fucking
It's a great
awesome
detail.
by the way. I love that movie. And, we also learned a lot about Ra's al Ghul in that context because we realized that he can infiltrate this prison, seemingly apropos of no resistance. What's curious to me about Rogue One is that we don't learn anything about Jyn as an adult just by placing her in that prison. The only way we learn about her as an adult is her reacting to the call to adventure when the good guys are like, listen, we need your bloody help, mate. And so it's just interesting contrasts in my mind of the way to approach two of those different openings that are very similarly structured in similarly structured action movies. It's just curious to me.
It is interesting because we are not necessarily shown that Jyn is a very competent hero. She's not incompetent by any means, but we're not seeing, oh, she's a fantastic fighter. Oh, she's a fantastic pilot. Oh, she's brilliant like her father. If anything, she is a hero because of who her father is, because of the relationship that she does have to her father, which is hard. That is hard, especially for a movie that features a female hero.
I will backtrack one of those statements because I analyzed her character a bit in the misogyny video. Saw Gerrera actually says at one point, you were the fiercest warrior I ever trained, or best soldier I ever trained, something like that. And actually, right before she gets captured by Saw Gerrera's gang, she's inside an armored transport, and she barehanded takes down 3 guards and then escapes, and she's only knocked down by the robot. So we actually see evidence of her being a good fighter before the scene where Saw Gerrera says, you are the best fighter I ever trained. So that's, the establishing visually and then confirming it with the dialogue that really placed her experience level, like Ryzo is talking about. Mm-hmm. It showed us beforehand before it confirmed it, and it made it so much more believable because it was like we talk about Rey. She's fighting out of nowhere, and you have to assume that she learned that as part of her survival skills or whatever, but we have no proof.
We do not see it happen. Yeah, no, that is a very good point, and I'm glad you said that because it does kind of reverse the way that I had been thinking about it. The angle that I was trying to take with it was that instead of perhaps, as the movie goes along, instead of the traditional hero's journey where it is really all focused on her and her abilities, that it's more focused on her relationship and her ability to get different disparate groups to work together and to form a team that can then achieve its goal. And by no means is she spearheading this operation. She's not, it's the budding rebellion that's the brains of the plan, but she's the crux of it. She is by far the person who all of the other people kind of see as the figure to look to as inspiration.
And one of the bigger problems with this entire story for me is her character, because what we have to assume from the introduction is that her entire purpose in life is going to be reuniting with her father.
Yeah.
But we don't really know what she wants throughout the entire rest of the film. She eventually sees her father gets killed in front of her, and it's not like she's doing the rest of this out of revenge. The entire second half of the movie is like, what does she want? You never could really tell. And you had the same problem with Rey throughout the sequel trilogy, not really knowing exactly what these main characters want, which the other films that we've discussed have done a much better job of, informing the audience of what's going on in the minds of those characters.
We can infer it. I mean, she was pretty much raised by Saw Gerrera, who was a militant anti-Empire guy, to the point that the rebellion didn't want to work with him anymore.
And that raising is another really interesting point that I thought of, comparing her to Peter Quill, because they both had the same childhood of either seeing someone die right in front of them and then they get separated out. Now they're living with, some kind of gang. And look at the personality differences between the two of them. They could not be more different people.
I think that's because, similar to with the Batman Begins example, one of them is being trained to be a soldier, right? Jin is being trained in this mercenary context of like she's being trained in a military context. Then you look at Peter Quill and Bruce Wayne, who are individualists who seek out specific training, right? Even though Peter Quill is raised by the Ravagers, they do not adhere to what we would consider to be like a typical structured combatant training. Like they're not an armed force, they're a group of thugs. Equally, Bruce Wayne goes out and he goes around the world and he teaches himself fucking martial arts and shit. The difference with Jin is that she is raised by someone who runs a mercenary, like they are mercenaries, they're not a gang. And I think that's the difference. That's why she functions well in the context of working for the general in the rebellion, is that she is a good soldier, and part of that training is her combat and her such and such and such and such. But it's the idea that like she is good at working within this particular structure, and she must learn to work outside that structure in order to achieve that goal by becoming the leader, and ditching some of the rules that she's become familiar with.
So and I keep asking this question because I think it's very important for the topic that we're talking about, which is, does the introduction work? Do we need to see her as a kid? Do we need to see her father taken? Do we need to have that loss, that initial trauma, in order for this movie to work? What would it be like if we started with her in prison, or we just started with her working in the rebellion? Like, what would that movie be?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, because
braver.
I don't think you don't see her loss come out nearly as much as you do with Peter Quill. Going back to that example, like anytime that the Walkman is brought up, because that represents his mother, you see him immediately, the switch flips and you see how much he cares because of what it represents. But you never see that with Jin. All she has is the necklace her mother gave her, but all she ever does is like lightly touch it. You never see any example of, like I said before, of any example of what she is thinking, what's going on inside her head. And we could assume that she's feeling all that same trauma that Peter is, but we never see any examples of it.
Jin is like just all drive, which is great from like a plot perspective. But if that's the case, if that's like kind of the only emotional crux of her character, you could have conveyed that opening scene in like a line of dialogue or something during a downbeat where she's like, yeah, Krennic killed my parents, and I don't know. I think it would have the same effect.
Yeah, and
honestly.
if you're trying to paint that character as hyper competent, just go down the Atomic Blonde route. Just give us this hyper competent warrior character and show them doing something and enforcing their will upon the world, and just let us infer the rest. I think it's what Pat said before. This movie, like, it is Star Wars, capital Star Wars. It is for everybody. The audience, nothing can be left to the assumption in these texts. Everything must be conveyed directly. And say what you will, like I think one of the biggest complaints and one of the reasons that Rian Johnson's take was less popular, aside from some of the plot elements, is just that Rian Johnson as a filmmaker relies a lot on inference. If you've seen Brick, you know that like there is a lot of things that Rian Johnson brings to bear in his texts that are so subtextual. And in fact, he even goes out of his way sometimes, if you've seen like Knives Out, where in adding text, he calls attention to meaning absent something else you would expect. So, like you have a scene where you've got a character who's going to do an action and you're expecting an outcome, and the outcome is robbed from you and something else happens, and the absence of the outcome is the meaning of the scene. He's very good at that stuff, but it's almost too much for your normal audience. They don't want to see risky movies. They want to feel comfortable. They want to be kind of cradled in that reliable hero's journey. They want to feel like the surprises need to be safe. They need to feel comfortable. We need things explained to us. We need to understand why it's okay for us to root for this very violent character who gets locked in prison. We need to have things explained to us in a very kind of cogent way so that we don't accidentally risk some audience members not liking Jin. And that is, in my opinion, the biggest crime of this type of narrative. And this is my opinion. You can love these movies, and I enjoy aspects of them. But in my opinion, when it comes to these Hollywood blockbusters where we're playing it very safe, the thing they always do, and so Star Wars, is they cannot risk you not liking these characters, because if you don't like these characters, there's a chance the text might challenge you, and we can't take that risk.
I think part of that reason also is just, I think that scene was something that they had in their heads, and they said, oh, what if the story opened up with some, cool looking stormtroopers walking across this bleak desolate wasteland, and they're going to go and kidnap someone. And then it almost felt like that was what the introduction was based around, was just this initial thought of, a visual, that they somehow decided to pen into the story because they needed some way to open the story. Because you're right, if you take out that entire opening scene, I'm not sure what you're left with. And another thought that I had based off what you were just talking about was the fact that Star Wars lays out in detail all of these things without trying to make the audience figure out subtext, I think goes back to the idea that most of the audience is not there to be a media critic. Like when I talk with my coworkers about certain scenes in movies, and they're like, I absolutely love this. Like Fat Thor in Infinity War. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They freaking love him. It makes me like viscerally angry that he is so depressed at the loss of his entire people that he is drinking himself, for a human, he probably would have drunk himself to death. Like they love the idea of a drunk who is depressed, because they're not looking at it like that. They're just seeing, oh, he's funny.
Well, it's also very fat-phobic, because they're laughing at the fact that he's fat. I think that movie manages to pull off being slightly less offensive than it could have been, because at the end, when he becomes Thor again,
he stays fat.
He doesn't get thin, he stays fat. And so they get a pass on this one because he's still powerful, but it is very fat-phobic in some ways. People don't, that's the thing. Like, I want to be very clear. People don't think about this stuff in the way that we're talking about it very often, because they don't do this for a living, right? The complication and the frustration is when you are someone that gets a huge budget to do this stuff, and you do this stuff for a living, and you run one of the biggest media companies on the planet, and you enforce this kind of ritualistic safety. It threatens the integrity of the medium. It threatens the integrity of, how do you get Villeneuve, millions of dollars to make a movie that doesn't make a return but is worthwhile because it was good art? How do you get A24 movies made on a budget that still look good? How do you get Dune fucking adapted into a movie? That's wild to me that they agreed to do that after Blade Runner. Like, there is still people out there pursuing these things, and we still have people in the common popular space creating things with artistic merit. You look at Dan Harmon, you look at even your South Park creators, people like that, still taking risks, doing interesting things. But it's just so disheartening when they come so close in Rogue One so many times to being really interesting, and they just walk up to the precipice and then they make Thor fat, and it happens every time.
I mean, I feel like, that is depressing, that it's not the good stuff isn't the popular stuff, but at the same time, like, you get it makes the Nolans and the Villeneuves all the more sweeter, when that stuff does get made. And I don't know. Yeah.
All right, we're about to run up on our time for this section. Anyone have any final thoughts about this?
I like her scarf. It's like a cool outfit. Yeah.
It is. Yeah, she has a cool outfit. No, the whole design, like the whole look, I think it does a very good job of playing with this isn't the Star Wars that you thought you knew, but yet it kind of is. They still did something different. They still played with some of the ideas and didn't make it too Star Warsy, and made it just like a generally better movie. I still think it is my favorite Star Wars movie to come out by Disney.
Yeah, I feel like what you just said about, like, it's kind of Star Wars but a bit different. That's a lot of that is communicated through the art direction, which I feel like is the strongest thing about this movie. So, props.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that most people say that, I've heard a lot of people say that the second half, especially that final battle scene, is what they feel like is the most Star Wars thing they've ever seen, which is really interesting that it's basically just the action of the X-Wing versus the TIE Fighter that people come back to as what defines Star Wars for them. And that's just a really interesting concept in and of itself.
I guess because at their heart, they're war movies. And that's plain dogfighting is the thing that made war movies popular. Like Top Gun is popular for a reason. It's very easy visual language to follow. And Star Wars takes that and makes it sci-fi and interesting and adds laser swords.
Yeah.
I love a good laser sword.
Hell yeah.
Well, kind of circling back to the entire point of what we were talking about of the introduction, how we should look at them and analyze the introduction, and it coming back to establishing the world. What kind of world building are we seeing and are we expecting to see throughout the rest of the movie? Who are the main characters? Do we have some kind of idea about the personality and what these characters want going forward and how that might change throughout the rest of the movie? And what is a basic idea of the plot and what we're immediately being introduced to as the plot and how that might progress towards the rest of the movie. So do you guys have any other final thoughts about, if we're just looking at this brief introduction of a film or a show, what we should be looking for as we're trying to do these kinds of analyses?
I mean, I think it ultimately boils down to introductions are one of the most important parts of your story. They're the onboarding mechanism by which your audience or reader is going to either buy into the premise or not. They're the thing that what you should do from a craft perspective is write the whole damn thing, and then you come back and you focus on the introduction, and you dwell on it and you spend time building it up. Because if you can get it right, then you're setting the rest of your story up for success. And if you don't pay it enough attention, if you don't consider the whys and the hows of it, then you're kind of setting yourself up for a much harder job later on in the text. You need to set up your emotional arcs, so your internal genres. You need to set up your external genres. You need to, like you said, place us somewhere in a setting. It doesn't have to be a location we recognize, but give us the rules of that setting. How does it function? What should we expect? And then conduct some kind of setup for either objects in space or the way that the story is going to resolve. And I think if you can do those things and do them economically, and do them with grace and class, you're going to find that people begin the story and go, wow, I'm hooked. And it's one of those things that you don't notice when it happens, but much like with most writing, the way that you notice it is often in its absence, and that's very unfortunate.
And if you're super talented, the opening will be a microcosm of the movie to come, in terms of themes and or plot. David, you did an analysis of the opening for Logan a while back, which you pretty much your conceit was that it's a microcosm of the movie as a whole, and yeah, that does it really well.
Yeah.
And I guess my takeaway is that an opening for a movie should not be able to be removed and have the movie still make sense. It should be so significant that it really establishes both theme, characters, and stakes in the movie to the point that you can't just take it out because it's unnecessary introduction.
Yep. Okay, well, that pretty much wraps up everything for this hopefully first section of mini sections. Fingers crossed we'll be able to go through an entire film looking at each part of it. I think we had talked about having world building be possibly the next subject that we look at. But as a final pitch, if everyone wants to go around and give your website or whatever again, and then maybe pitch any other channel or artist, critic that you feel like everyone should know about. David,
so you can find all of my novels at maynardtrig.com, 2Gs for Trig. It's the best place to go and help support me. Otherwise, all of our content is on zeroindent.com. If you like this kind of conversation, you will love the articles there. It's where we house all of our media crit. A media writer that I would love to shout out that I think everybody should be reading is Rob Zacny from Waypoint Radio / Vice Games. Rob Zacny is one of the most talented media writers alive and working today. I would encourage you to pursue his work. And in fact, all of the Vice Games / Waypoint crew are all tremendously talented.
Yeah, if you like this kind of stuff at Zero Indent, I have a podcast called Method to the Madness. Film analysis within a philosophical framework. If you're a fan of Wisecrack and their podcast, Show Me the Meaning, it's pretty much has the same structure as that. And yeah, in terms of shouting out people, I don't know, just video essayists, Channel Criswell. Wait, no, they're not called that anymore. The Cinema Cartographer, I believe, is what they're called now. Every Frame of Painting, Just Right. They're all great people for narrative theory.
Well, my podcast is Diamonds in the Rough Draft, and go to it for just like a really nitty gritty examination of what writing is supposed to do, and none of it is film related, although I do have some scripts that I could totally do and I haven't done yet, so I might actually delve into that. But it's more about looking at old writings and trying to pick out the good and get rid of the bad and see what is this story trying to do. And it's really just a critique session between my wife and I of saying, what can we turn this story into? How can we turn it into something that is actually worth consuming? Plus, as part of the shtick, we drink a new local beer and talk about it every time. Because draft, I don't know, it was enough, and it gives me an excuse to buy local beer. So it's the best idea I've ever had.
I love it.
Yeah. And then I already mentioned him once, but Patrick Willems is one of my favorite guys that I do like to watch, and I guess the pragmatism of what he does really speaks to me, because there's a lot of, when you're getting into critique, there's a lot of hoity-toity kind of like arts. But sometimes it's nice to be able to apply it to something, and a lot of my favorite critics always kind of bring it back towards like, we are people. What can this teach us as people about how we interact with other people? And I feel like his channel does a really good job of that, of showing us at the end of the day, like, this is why we consume art. This is why we are doing this. This is what we are trying to learn, and how we are trying to grow.
And obviously, if you're watching this, you've already found my channel, so no need to plug that. As someone that I would want to recommend, there's actually a music channel on YouTube that's run by Samuel Kim. Really love. He does some really unique compositions. He'll take like the Winter Soldier theme and combine that with a different theme from like the Batman theme. He'll combine the two musical themes together in some of the most brilliant ways that I've ever heard. Really love his stuff.
Is he the one who did the song, the Witcher song?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. He's good. I've heard.
Yeah, apparently I talk about him a lot. So
you just sent it to me every day until I listened to it. Okay.
I think it would also be remiss of us not to shout out Ryebold. We mentioned him a few times. Ryebold on YouTube. I think Darth and I are both huge fans. Go check out his work as well.
Yeah, that is interesting. How I'll have to tell him how much we talked about him while he wasn't here.
He'll be chuffed.
Yeah, like the man, the myth, the legend. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone joining, and we will hopefully do this again very soon.
Absolutely.
See ya.
See ya.
All right. Have a good afternoon. Is there an off button?
There is. I just gotta find it.
All right.